Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas from experts on diversity and inclusion. In this bonus episode, I'm going to share my thoughts and ideas on what I'm seeing from my clients in the trenches in this ever so changing year of the 2020. And together we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. I share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey and requires bravery and courage, and you don't have to do this alone. And Next Pivot Point, I believe we're stronger together. We are one. The subject of today's conversation is a very hot topic. So many of my clients are coming to me with this question. How do I measure diversity and inclusion? So this is you. You're not alone. I did a LinkedIn poll earlier this month. Overwhelmingly, nearly 60% of business leaders say that this is the burning issue around D&I going into next year. So good news, you're not alone. Bad news is no one has this figured out. Now, not everyone, I would say, but there are very few organizations that have this dialed in. Now, what I want to do in this episode is share what I recommend as best practices for measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization. If you're not measuring it yet, I will say you are behind. Many organizations have been measuring this or beginning to measure this now. So I would encourage you, if diversity and inclusion is important to your organization, just like any business metric, you would measure it. It is essentially the same thing as saying profitability is important and not measuring it. So I like to poke a little bit here because people can tell if you mean it or not based on what you measure. So that old adage, inspect what you expect, is very true. And I'll tell you, employees will tell me that I know this isn't really that important to my organization because we only talk about it once a year. We don't have any metrics on it. There's no accountability around it. We don't have goals on it. So if that's your organization, no matter what you say, no matter what you do, it's going to fall on deaf ears. So have a measurement strategy. Measure it. Now, a couple things I want to share with you from a best practice standpoint. You do not have to have goals. Okay. And so this sounds a little counterintuitive. I'm telling you to have metrics, but not goals. What do I mean? Goals signal a little bit of the old days of affirmative action. They signal a zero-sum game. Sometimes they trigger the majority group, being white men in most organizations, to say, oh, so we're just promoting now diverse, quote unquote, people. Therefore, white men don't get promoted anymore. Now, of course, this is not true, but there is a legitimate fear around it. So when organizations set diversity goals to have so many people, so many women in leadership, so many people of color, recruited, hired, however it's being sliced and diced, the warning factor that I always share with my clients, there's pros and cons to that approach. Pros are you're probably going to get more of those people in the pipeline and promoted. Cons are you're going to create a perception that that's why they got in the door and got promoted. So either you got to manage that perception very diligently to not create that zero-sum game mentality. And of course, diversity is not a zero-sum game. We all win when we're inclusive. We all win. And the pie gets bigger together. It's not my slice versus your slice, but we need to tell that story. So if you're prepared to tell that story around your goals, that's okay. So I'm not telling you what to do. It has to fit your culture and how you go about this and where you've been and where you want to go. I do argue, though, for metrics. So regardless if you want to set diversity goals, I would highly encourage you to set metrics around it. So what do I mean by that? I mean that you need to take some data, and it's probably living in your HR, human resources, information system, whatever system you're using, whatever platform you have, even the most archaic of platforms that I've worked with back in the way back days of my corporate America career. There are systems where you can gather diversity dimension data. Primarily, what's most readily available is gender identity and racial identity, ethnicity. So you want to take those pieces out of your HRIS system and you want to consider other diversity dimensions. So I do not like to keep the diversity, equity, inclusion conversation centered on race and gender. I argue to broaden it. It brings other allies into the conversation. It helps people see it as just not an optical conversation about what's visible, because oftentimes there are invisible or non-apparent factors around diversity and inclusion way beyond gender and race and ethnicity. LGBTQ plus is an obvious one, as well as disabilities, as well as veteran status, socioeconomic status, industry representative, perspective. And that's really broad. But what perspectives are important in your organization as you think about how you have diversity, equity, and inclusion defined? And if you don't have it defined, go back to our last bonus episode. We walked you through how to define your strategy and define the what for diversity and inclusion. So if you know what dimensions of diversity are important at your organization, maybe it's race and gender to start, and then again, please broaden it. Consider these factors. And you might want to measure different data points in the employee experience from your HRIS system or whatever system you have on employee data. Overall headcount, hires, turnover, promotions, high potential identification, salary or compensation ratios, and separation data, exit data. So any one of those factors, and ideally where we want to go is from how we recruit to how we separate. And every stop in between on the employee experience, we should have a measurement for it, baseline data. So ideally, you would be able to say, this year, we had this many women, this many people of color, this many of these ethnicities, whatever it is that you're measuring from a diversity dimension perspective. And across that employee experience, we had this overall headcount, we had this many hires, we had this much turnover, this much promotions, this much high potential data, this much salary comp ratios, and separations. Then you'd have baseline data to show this is where we stand today. If you don't know where you are, how in the heck are you ever going to know where you're going? So this is essential to have a baseline, to have this is the line in the sand. This is where we're starting. And then you can set maybe even some goals, then at that point, considering making percentage lift goals, or at a minimum, we just want to improve our representation in these parts of the employee experience. And a couple other best practices I would share, get that dashboard together, make it super simple for people to digest this information. Hold leaders accountable. If you don't have your senior leadership team involved in this, it will not work. I have a few clients right now I'm working with that their senior leadership team is not engaged, and I will tell you, it is a futile effort. It is a waste of money. Because if your leadership team is saying one thing and the diversity team is doing another, you're not going to get anywhere. Okay. And it has to be properly resourced as well. So if this is important and we've chosen to measure it, how often are we going to measure it? Right? I would suggest at least quarterly. Annually is definitely not enough. Monthly might be too much. I would have it broken out by leader. Part of the organization. Every senior leader can be accountable for their data. And we're going to have a conversation regularly, an intentional, consistent conversation about what this data means and what we're willing to do as a result of this data. Some other things to consider from a best practice perspective is measuring things like activities. So it may not just be employee data. It may also be the number of programs you have around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or training events. Could be pulse survey data about attitudes and beliefs about diversity and inclusion. Could be community activities in diversity and inclusion. So there's lots of different activities that you can also measure that also signal with those behaviors, then we should be driving the outcomes. Those are more like leading indicators versus lagging indicators with the employee data. Now, after you've got your data, whatever you've chosen to measure on your dashboard, I would consider asking these key questions to facilitate a dialogue about the so what. The what is the data, but so what matters so much more. I would say, what story is this data telling us? Where are the gaps? What dimensions of diversity are not improving or maybe even sliding back and getting worse? Where are we in comparison to the industry? So having industry comparisons, industry comp data should be readily available by an industry association group or those that you know, peers in your industry. What areas can we improve realistically with our current resources or our current spend around diversity and inclusion? If you don't have much of a spend, you're not going to be able to get there as quickly. So let's be realistic. Let's dial it in. And then think about, what's the frequency? How do I communicate this data with all employees? Because maybe we don't communicate all of it, but maybe we have pieces and parts of it that are very intentionally and consistently communicated to the rest of our team. And then who do I involve in the process, right? We want to get the senior most leaders involved. We want to get the middle manager involved too. So what does that communication process look like from the top down and in between? And really need to think intentionally, again, and consistently about this message over time. So that was a lot of information to unpack. Hopefully you got some ideas for why goals may not be the place to start, why metrics might be the place to start, different sources of data, some elements from your HRIS system that you could potentially include, as well as activity levels in other areas. And then some key questions to facilitate in that so what conversation, and how to set up a plan around communication on the back end and who and how to include the right people at the right times. So if you liked this, we are offering an online workshop on how to measure diversity and inclusion in January. Do join us there. I will link to that in the show notes. You have a chance to interact with your peers in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, compare notes, get some best practices, some stories, ideas, and build off of this content. It's a great time to start early 2021, getting a good plan, a good measurement plan around diversity and inclusion, because according to what I'm seeing, this is going to be one of the biggest things to focus on in the diversity world in this next year. So it's not too late to get a head start on that and to get some tools in your toolkit around it. Thank you so much for listening to this bonus episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Hit the share button, connect with me on LinkedIn, and you can search for me there. I post every day, Julie Kratz, Kratz. You can find us and share this episode anywhere you get podcasts. Every review helps allies find us. I host this podcast because I believe we're stronger together. We are one.